Bulgaria is sometimes considered the smallest major player of the Great War, at very least the smallest member of the Central Powers. Early considerations of Bulgaria as an ally by both the Entente and Central Powers reflected this, with many simply wishing for Bulgaria to remain neutral. But as the conflict ground to a stalemate not only in the west but in the front between Austria and Serbia, and especially as new players joined the war, Bulgaria found itself in an increasingly valuable position to both factions. It now became a question of who would offer the small Tsardom the most for its support. Of course, in our timeline, Bulgaria wound up joining the Central Powers. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, Bulgaria joined the Triple Entente? Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another alternate history scenario, and if you're new to the channel, welcome, and stay tuned. To understand the position of Bulgaria at the outbreak of the Great War, we first need to dial the timeline back about 2 years. In 1912, the East Orthodox nations of Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro came together in a mutual opposition to the ever-waning power of the Ottomans, who still held on to a significant amount of territory in the southern Balkans. This Balkan League launched the First Balkan War against the Ottomans, and Bulgaria, as the strongest military power of the Balkan League, assumed that it would reap the greatest bounty of territory post-war. Bulgaria aimed to expand into the lands it was promised by the 1878 Treaty of San Stefano, which followed the Russian-Turkish War. While the treaty was later superseded by the Treaty of Berlin, Bulgaria never lost sight of these lands, which did possess a sizable ethnic Bulgarian population, and which placed Bulgaria in a position which might allow for future expansions west and southward, establishing major coastlines along the Adriatic and Aegean seas. The Serbs and Greeks, however, had their own ambitions of grandeur. By 1900, the Serbs had already considered the concept of a united South Slavic state with themselves as the nucleus, but repeatedly these ideas fell out of vogue and were dismissed as the idealistic visions of Croats and Slovenes who only wanted to exploit Serbia in such a union, and in fact the Yugoslav idea was primarily promoted by these countries at the time. Above all else, Serbia sought the liberation of and unity with the Serbs then under Ottoman rule, that is, until 1903. In June of that year, the King and Queen of Serbia were assassinated, killed in their bedroom, and thrown from the window of their palace by the secret society that would eventually become known as Unification or Death, aka the Black Hand. The royals who had been allies of Austria-Hungary and opposed to Yugoslav unity were replaced by the pro-Russian, pro-Yugoslav Peter I. Serbia now found itself on its own path for Balkan domination, and come the First Balkan War, sought to extract strategic gains from the war with the Ottomans which would allow it to grow into a regional leader independent of Austrian, Ottoman, and Russian control. Now, the Greeks were the very first of the Balkan states to break free of Ottoman control, and had long sought to reclaim their former glory as the great power of the East Mediterranean, a concept that became known as the Megali idea. But for quite a time, the opportunity appeared well out of reach. The Greeks sought control of the Aegean Sea, which would demand occupation of Ottoman-controlled Macedonia, Thrace, and the Anatolian coast, not to mention the various islands in between, all of which contained substantial Greek populations or carried historic significance to the Greek people. Fortunately for Greece, by the time of the First Balkan War, they were in a unique position to challenge the Ottoman navy with their own, allowing the Serbs and Bulgarians to clear the Turks out of the Balkans without the threat of reinforcements from Anatolia. The Turks were defeated and expelled from all but Constantinople, a territory which Russia had resisted handing to Bulgaria because of its own ambitions for it. Some land was denied to the Greeks and Serbs by the mediating great powers to make room for an independent Albania, which the Austrians saw as a check against Serbian expansion and potential domination of the Adriatic. Post-war, former Ottoman lands in the Balkans were divided between the Balkan League, but it was then that the conflicting ambitions of the Balkan states truly manifested, most especially between Bulgaria and Serbia over the lands of Macedonia. The Bulgarians had been bogged down with the Thracian theater of the conflict, arguably the most important theater of the war, allowing the Serbs and Greeks to occupy much of western Macedonia and establish a border which cut Bulgaria off from further westward expansion. Despite pre-war agreements on the division of land, Serbia and Greece, fearing Bulgarian ambitions and seeking to further their own, refused to surrender any lands they had occupied, leaving Bulgaria frustrated but determined to extract what it felt was rightfully its own. Thus, the Second Balkan War broke out, with all of Bulgaria's neighbors and Montenegro turning against it. The Bulgarians were stripped of much land and left embittered. The Great War would break out almost 1 year later, and with the Serbs seemingly responsible for its outbreak, as well as with the entry of the Ottomans into the conflict, the Bulgarians saw an opportunity to retake that which was lost, and perhaps more. Now before we go any further, let's take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Enlisted. Enlisted is a free-to-play World War II multiplayer shooter game available to play on PC, Xbox Series S and X, there's a difference, PlayStation 5, and now available on Xbox One and PS4, all with cross-platform play so you can play with your friends across all consoles in the same games. Real-time strategizing and communication with your team is important in this game that stresses realism in environments, uniforms, weaponry, and damage, without compromising on the classic shooter mechanics that really give this game an almost nostalgic feel. Your soldier has his own skills and weaponry, and you can build your skill level and change your equipment as you progress. Build fortifications or take command of a vehicle with your team to deal heavier damage to hunker down enemies. Follow the link in the description to play Enlisted for free and get a free bonus on sign up. Now, back to the video. With many of the great powers anticipating a swift victory, Bulgaria was initially dismissed as unnecessary, but once it became clear that this would be a much larger war, a strategically located state like Bulgaria suddenly became a valuable piece to whichever faction brought it into play. For the Central Powers, Bulgaria could finally break Serbia, bringing the Balkans under their domination, compromising the security of Romania and by extension Russia, and link the Ottomans with their German and Austrian allies in the north. For the Triple Entente, Bulgaria could reinforce Serbia, compromise the security of the Ottomans, and effectively isolate them from Germany and Austria, who would then be forced to invest more heavily into the southern front, potentially allowing France to break the stalemate in the west. For Bulgaria, the question was simply a matter of who could offer them more for less: territory and odds. The Bulgarians assumed the Central Powers would provide them Serbian land as compensation, while the Entente would provide them Ottoman land. Ideally, they hoped to extract some from both. Moreover, the Bulgarians didn't want to end up pulling the weight of an otherwise failing faction. Bulgaria's government paid close attention to the victories and losses of both sides to gauge whether or not investment in one or the other would be more costly. In our timeline, the Entente's promises were vague, and efforts to persuade Serbia to concede land to Bulgaria in exchange for Austrian territory proved largely fruitless. The Serbs originally refusing to even acknowledge the proposition and later asserting that they'd rather lose all of Bosnia to Austria than to give Macedonia to Bulgaria. The Entente's offer to Serbia became essentially empty once Italy joined the war and made claims to those same territories offered to Serbia as compensation for their own concession. Similar issues arose when additional promises of Greek land were made to Bulgaria without the consent of Greece. The Central Powers, in contrast, promised Bulgaria all of Serbian-occupied Macedonia, a concession of Ottoman land in Thrace, and if Greece or Romania were to enter the war, land from those countries as well. The Central Powers had also just come off a seeming string of victories against the Entente that left the Bulgarians confident that Germany would ultimately triumph, and thus, in October of 1915, Bulgaria joined the Central Powers. But this time, things are different. Early on, the Russians, who had been Serbia's closest ally among the great powers, had been attempting to persuade the Serbs to concede land to Bulgaria in exchange for their support in defeating Austria. The Russians still hoped for unity between the Orthodox Balkan countries, and tried to make clear to Serbia that even if they were to concede all lands desired by Bulgaria, defeating Austria would open the door for the Serbians to annex Bosnia, Croatia, and Slovenia, and liberate the Balkans from Austrian and Catholic domination. The Serbs, however, through a combination of resentment toward Bulgaria, pride in their own abilities, ambitions of personal Balkan domination, and a failure to realize the eventual scale of the conflict, refused to back down, while Russia, who did carry significant sway over Serbia, refused to increase their pressure on the country, which had pulled them and the rest of the great powers into war. The British were the most hesitant of the Entente powers to explore alliance with Bulgaria, fearing that it would only stretch Entente resources and anger other potential allies like Romania and Greece. As a consequence, efforts to court Bulgaria as an ally by the Entente often came off as half-hearted. Failures of British diplomacy were also partially to blame for a lack of cooperation from Greece, with whom Britain had fostered a special partnership since its independence. On the question of the war, Greece was divided between its pro-Entente prime minister and the pro-German king, but both generally agreed that for the time being, neutrality was their best option. An early Greek entry into the war on the side of the Entente might have provoked the Bulgarians to immediately side with the Central Powers, with the hopes of extracting land from Greece and Serbia by force. The Serbs were in no real position to challenge this, and the Greeks simply didn't have the land power to face Bulgaria without considerable outside support during the first years of the war. An entry of Greece on the side of the Central Powers would have also brought major issues, as while the Greeks were a powerful naval force in the Aegean, they would not stand a chance against Britain's Royal Navy, who could easily subdue the largely coastal country. Friendly neutrality remained the approach until changes of circumstance allowed Greece to play a more valuable role in the conflict's final years. Bulgaria's alliance with the Entente complicates that, however. The closest the Entente came to bringing Bulgaria over to their side was by offering them concessions from all of their neighbors, both friend and foe. Greece had always been on the chopping block in some capacity, which at times swayed the Greeks closer to the German camp. Regardless of circumstances, however, the Greeks would not be able to throw their lot in with the Germans and not face major repercussions, nor could they expect any worthwhile gains from such a costly alliance. They could be bribed to remain neutral, but even then there is only so much the Central Powers could offer them. The Entente, on the other hand, while demanding concessions from Greece, had considered recompensating them for their losses with highly desired lands in Anatolia, an arrangement they were more open to than the Serbs, who had continually resisted the idea of concessions and recompensation. Italy's entry into the Triple Entente also complicates this, as the Italians would eventually make their own demands in Anatolia. It wasn't unheard of for the Triple Entente to make promises via secret treaties that they would struggle to deliver upon, but it is clear that if Bulgaria was brought into the alliance, more promises would need to be broken, altered, or never made. For the sake of this scenario, however, we will be assuming that promises to Bulgaria are not broken post-war. While we could imagine a hypothetical in which Bulgaria joins the alliance in place of Italy, who simply remains neutral, realistically these major efforts to recruit Bulgaria would not have taken off until the alliance with Italy was already in motion. But one might also argue that once Italy joined with the intent of claiming lands in Dalmatia, any real chance of convincing Serbia to concede land in exchange for former Austrian territories would be gone, which in turn means Macedonia would not be promised to Bulgaria, and thus they never joined the Entente. Let's play it safe and imagine a timeline where Russia is somehow able to convince both France and Britain very early on to pursue an entry of Bulgaria into the war instead of Italy. Austria simply will not give the Italians the land they want, and the odds of them rejoining the Central Powers after having left the alliance are very slim. Thus, the Italians can be considered a safe neutral player by the Entente and not one necessary to pull into the conflict. Bulgaria, on the other hand, shares a border with a Central Power and an Entente power, along with two potential ally states unlikely to side with the Central Powers. In this alternate timeline, Bulgaria is sold by Russia as the country that could secure the Balkans for the Triple Entente, and their allegiance becomes a top priority. The great powers collectively pressure Serbia to concede Macedonia in exchange for Croatia, Slovenia, and Bosnia upon Austria's defeat. Greece is convinced to cede its eastern holdings in exchange for post-war land in Anatolia, and Romania would be made to return southern Dobruja, which they took from Bulgaria in the Second Balkan War, in exchange for ethnically Romanian lands in the Austrian Empire. By early 1915, shortly after the entry of the Ottomans on the side of the Central Powers, Bulgaria joins the Entente. Without an Italian front to place additional pressure upon Austria, the Bulgarians and Serbians would face greater resistance, but ultimately would break Austria's defenses and begin advancing up the Danube. This would not be a top priority for Bulgaria, however, nor had it been the most immediate consideration for the Entente, who had preferred the Ottomans be neutralized first to free up resources in the north. The Bulgarian ideal would be to provide as little support to Serbia as possible, forcing them to do the heavy lifting and preventing them from being in a stronger position post-war from which to contest Bulgarian claims. Support would be given, but greater investment could wait. With the Balkans essentially brought under near total Entente control, Bulgarian focus would primarily be concentrated against the Ottomans in eastern Thrace, essentially repeating their approach to the First Balkan War. The naval campaign aimed against the Ottoman Straits would carry on with far greater success thanks to the now local port of Alexandroupolis provided by Bulgaria. But Gallipoli would not be the only stress factor upon the Ottomans either, as the Bulgarian land invasion of eastern Thrace would threaten Constantinople more directly. With the Central Powers divided, and with Germany now shouldering a greater burden on the part of Austria in both the southern and eastern fronts, the Western Front would begin to shift in French favor, gradually giving way. The Ottomans would be the first to fall, followed by the Austrians, and finally Germany would capitulate, bringing about an Entente victory by 1916. With the war ending far earlier, neither Germany, France, nor Russia are exhausted by the conflict, but with the fall of Austria and the Ottomans, it became clear that the Germans could not carry on alone. The German surrender is more dignified, and being in a stronger position to negotiate post-war agreements, only faces the loss of Alsace-Lorraine and southern Schleswig on top of a relatively small war debt. The consequences for Austria and Turkey, however, are far more severe. In this alternate timeline, the Great War truly becomes an expanded Balkan War, a war of emerging states and of a struggle for dominance between those states against the old waning powers who once subjugated them. Naturally, these waning powers were forced to make way for these states. Serbia would partially achieve its goal of unification at the expense of Austria, but would lose its dominance of the south to Bulgaria. The Bulgarians, having demonstrated unwavering expansionist ambitions even following their defeat in the Second Balkan War, would seize and hold on to Constantinople despite resistance from Russia, who would ultimately relent on the issue on the justification that it was not worth destabilizing the region once again, and that at the very least the city was occupied by an Orthodox power.
He's nice.
This would, however, prompt Russia to place a greater emphasis on courting Bulgaria as a close partner post-war, likely at the expense of Serbia. But also keeping in mind that if relations were to sour between the two, Russia and Serbia could invade and partition Bulgaria at a later point.
I promise you, pain without end.
While Greece had lost some land in continental Europe, it had more than doubled that territory through its Anatolian acquisitions along the coast, allowing it to further develop its might as a naval power. The remaining partition of the Ottoman Empire would follow the early Entente plans of our timeline, leaving the Turks with only a sliver of land along the Black Sea. Turkish retaliation could almost certainly be expected in the same vein as the Turkish War for Independence, but with the inclusion of a non-destabilized Russia along with a heavily invested Bulgaria, the occupying powers would be in a better position to combat the Turkish uprising. A war which ends earlier of course spares Russia the destabilizing effects which led to the overthrow of the Tsar and prevents Germany from sending Lenin back to lead the Bolshevik Revolution. Conditions within Russia would still be tense, but for the time being, the Tsar and his government have the opportunity to course correct. Whether or not such efforts would succeed is unclear, and it is still possible the Tsar's authority will eventually be curtailed, though not entirely done away with. From Austria, Russia would extract the Slavic lands of Galicia, incorporating them into their own borders. With neither Germany nor Russia being severely weakened, as well as with the absence of the United States and Wilson's 14 points, an independent Poland is never re-established. An independent state which would emerge is the Kingdom of Hungary, who, after years of clashing with the Austrians and demands for greater autonomy, would finally break off the withering empire to go its own way. Refusing to allow the Germans or Austrians to consolidate their strength following this conflict, some agreement would likely still be made to prevent onslaughts, at least for a temporary period of time, as once again Germany would not have been as thoroughly beaten this time around, and indefinite enforcement of this policy would be unrealistic. The Italians who sat the conflict out this time around would receive minor gains from Austria's compensation for their neutrality. Because Italy had not sacrificed much but still gained some territory, the mutilated victory narrative never emerges, and the conditions within the country which led to the rise of fascism likely don't follow either. That being said, it would still be apparent to Italy that full unification had not been achieved, and that land would still need to be extracted from Serbia by force. This dynamic, along with the lingering hostilities between Bulgaria and Serbia, would make Italy a natural ally of Bulgaria. Greece would find itself in a neutral but pragmatic position. Together, it and Bulgaria could fully dominate the East Mediterranean, but if one were to overpower the other and take its land, the remaining state would carry that full potential itself. Realistically, however, the Greeks would know that they could not risk destabilizing Bulgaria if the Bulgarians were willing to be an ally. For Greece to instigate conflict with Bulgaria would simply open the door for domination by Russia or Serbia, neither of which the Greeks could face on their own. So as long as they and Bulgaria remain on civil terms, the two would continue to benefit one another. The new great powers of the Balkans had emerged, and along with them came a new balance of power and a new struggle for dominance. Once again, let's thank Enlisted for sponsoring today's video. Click the link in the description to start playing this epic World War II game for free on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox, and get a special bonus on sign up.